Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Industry Insights. I'm your host, Leah Troscianecki, and I am joined today by a very good friend of mine, special guest of the show, Sam Nicholls. Sam, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me, Leah, and thanks for the warm introduction. Special guest. I
Absolutely.
feel honored.
Special guest. Exactly. Well, Sam and I are longtime team members, specializing in our cloud business. And if you have tuned into any other Industry Insights show, you know that I will always find an opportunity to talk about cloud hosting technology. And something that Sam and I in particular are super passionate about is talking about spend in the cloud. I know everybody loves to talk about budgeting, but one of the things that's really interesting about cloud technologies, it does really change the game about IT budgeting, IT spend. It no longer becomes this lofty procurement process, and instead it really is up to a lot of the technology owners to make sure they understand all the implications about architecting, engineering, and ultimately managing solutions on a day-to-day basis to make sure you don't get that pesky bill shock. So today, Sam and I are going to talk a bit about some of the common kinds of costs when it comes to cloud infrastructure and cloud management. And we're going to spotlight a really cool story that we did with Forrester that's kind of a look at what the total economic impact was for a Veeam customer that was using Veeam on their AWS environments. But before we get to that, let's lay that groundwork with really understanding some of these elements of cloud spend. And hopefully for you all out there, you've probably got some level of familiarity with cloud technology, but it's always good to get back to those basics and understand really the scaffolding of what goes into managing these cloud costs. So Sam, let's talk a bit about this. I know, some of the obvious ones on this list would be compute and storage, right? And when you're looking at something like an Azure calculator or an AWS calculator, you can see a lot of those things pretty easily, right? But there's some other pitfalls that folks don't necessarily think about around networking, transactions, even egress fees. And if anybody is in the audience that is kind of big on the cloud space, let us know in the chat what you guys kind of commonly run into when it comes to controlling these cloud costs. I mentioned that word fees. Hopefully that wasn't super triggering for everyone, but if you do spend a lot of time in the cloud, I'm sure that your brain is kind of spinning. So let us know in the chat what some of those common challenges are for cloud management that you have. And also let us know where you're calling in from today. Of course, our show is live and we are super excited to be joining folks from all around the world. A bit later in our show, we'll put up a map to show everybody where you're all calling in from. So let us know in the chat where you're in, and we will light that map up in just a little bit. But Sam, let's talk about some of these kind of more unique aspects of managing cloud spend.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a little bit disappointed as well, Leah, because you deliberately overlooked the wonderful pun that I put in the subtitle, cost factors that shouldn't be missed. Come on.
See,
I'm one for dad jokes.
You do love a dad joke, and I didn't want to kind of rain on that parade. I wanted to give you the ability to tee that up on your own. So I'm really honoring your dad joke fandom.
All right, well, seriously, there's another one for you. Let's get down into it. So I think, when we look at cloud spend, actually, let's take a few steps back and look at some industry data around some of the biggest challenges in the public cloud. There's a particular report that's published by Flexera every year called the State of the Cloud Trends Report. And interestingly, this year, from the enterprise to the SMB and everyone in between, the top cloud challenge for organizations was controlling cloud costs. That topped governance, it topped security, it topped being able to efficiently manage hybrid and multi-cloud. And I think, as we transition to the cloud, there's the technology learning curve, but there's also that financial learning curve. We're moving from a capital expenditure model where we procured various hardware and software components, self-managed that on premises in the data center, and we didn't have to think about some of these like transaction components, right? The storage that we had was the volume of storage, it's the capacity that we got. And no matter how much we interact with that, we're not paying anything additional. Now, in the public cloud, as we move to this, not just operational expenditure, but something that's billed based on what you use monthly in arrears, we see a number of organizations land up with something called bill shock. Particularly when it comes to data protection, because a backup, we're ultimately creating and storing and moving copies of data for a specified period of time. And to create those copies of data takes compute. To store those copies of data takes storage. Maybe we have to move it to a different region within that cloud service provider's network. So we have to look at regional traffic costs. Transactions are a big one. These are the API calls to interact with things like the storage in order to write the data, access the data, read the data. And then, of course, the egress component as well. And that is a maybe, right? Maybe you're wanting to egress data out of the cloud and store it somewhere else. Maybe you want to do a recovery out of the cloud. Maybe you want to migrate out of the cloud. Ultimately, all of these things should be considered when you're looking not just at a data protection solution, but a cloud solution overall. Being able to understand where all of these things are charged and then how to optimize your usage of these components and align them with your strategies is ultimately going to help you control that spend better.
Yeah, definitely. And I think especially when it comes to this backup category, we talk a lot about portability of data or resilience of data. So moving data between locations, moving data between platforms might be something that's part of your resilience strategy. So getting ahead of those kinds of egress fees, better understanding how you can control them, plan for them, again, architect your environment, set those policies. Those are all going to be really important ways that we look at managing these kinds of costs. So hopefully, again, this gives you kind of a scaffolding of some of the ways that we talk about spend in the cloud. And that'll dovetail nicely into what we're going to talk about next. But before I get to that, I want to remind everyone that we would really love to hear from you all where you're dialing in from. So I think we're going to go ahead and put up our map, but please keep commenting in the chat from whatever platform you're calling in from to let us know where you're joining, because I think one of the beautiful things about this show is we're able to connect on trends and insights in the data protection space from around the world. So you get this really lovely bird's eye view of our map here. But if we go ahead and zoom in on North America, of course, I am joining you from the great state of Ohio. We kick off our Ohio State football season on Saturday with quite a cupcake game, but that's all right. We also have production joining us from Texas as well. And then we've got some additional folks. Florida hasn't popped on our map in a while. Really excited to have you all join us, as well as some folks in Colorado. I believe I saw a comment that said Denver in there, as well as New York. Sam is, of course, calling us in from the great state of Wisconsin. He is not calling in from the UK. He is, in fact, a transplant because he does love living in Wisconsin for some reason, even though it's very cold. Over in Europe. No, you'll betcha with those hot dishes. But he does actually have some folks joining us from the United Kingdom. Again, that's not Sam. Thank you all so much in the audience for joining us in the UK, as well as Spain and Germany. Thank you for joining us. And then if we go ahead and flip to South America, I don't think we've had Argentina or Bolivia on the map in a while. So thank you all so much for letting us know that you're calling in from those countries. It's always fun to fill that map out. And then if we finally flip over to Asia, we of course have India. Thank you all so much for joining us. You guys always have a great viewership coming from that country. So thank you all so much. Please, again, let us know in the chat. We'll light that map up again later so we can see where everybody's calling in from. But with that, Sam, I'd love to flip this over and talk a bit about this really awesome total economic impact study that you all did with Forrester. So why don't you walk us through some of those key insights that you found?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've got a number of customer success stories out there that talk about their utilization with Veeam and the public cloud and the benefits that they realized, but really doing this with that unbiased third party Forrester and the mechanisms that they use to understand really how this company is using Veeam, and in this case AWS, and how they calculate all of these benefits have been really eye-opening. So the TEI study is something that we absolutely contracted from Forrester jointly with AWS. We based it on a North American-based multi-billion-dollar global organization that had actually been using Veeam Data Platform for 3 years. So Veeam Data Platform is the core product within the Veeam portfolio. I think a lot of you guys know and love it for how it protects your on-premises workloads, but it equally extends natively out to public cloud resources. So virtual machines, databases, file shares, object storage that you might have in the public cloud. Veeam Data Platform can protect that stuff as well. They'd actually been using AWS for 6 years, but just a few more demographics about the organization: 600 plus locations across the globe, 30,000 employees, and 2 large data centers. So, like we say, pretty large organization, and we'll kind of see that with some of the numbers that are witnessed, but we'll put those into percentages as well in terms of better helping you relate that to your organization. If we flip to the next slide, actually, we can see that that they had a number of key challenges. Like I said, they've been utilizing Veeam Data Platform for a number of years, but there had been a number of acquisitions that they had made. And like anyone that's been through an acquisition of organization, you know that you inherit technical debt. There's specific pieces of hardware, cloud components, software that you also inherit that ultimately you've got to manage it first before you start looking at how you're going to integrate that into their business. And that was absolutely true for their data protection technologies, right? They had Veeam Data Platform that they were initially using for their on-premises workloads. They made these acquisitions and brought more AWS workloads on. They also brought on more backup tools. And how many tools does your organization want to utilize and manage to ultimately achieve the same outcome? So they have multiple different point products to essentially address the same thing. With all those different point products comes people as well, right? So they have ultimately had 10 engineers, FTEs, that were responsible for managing and monitoring those tools across, let's be honest, a very, very large environment. But it wasn't just the personnel and the software costs, it was the backup storage costs. And we kind of touched on this in the previous slides before we went into the map about the storage piece. One thing that I really want to drive home for you guys is I think everyone here understands that data doesn't protect itself. And even if you're using public cloud resources, whether it's infrastructure, platform, or software as a service, the data that you put in and on the public cloud is your data and your responsibility to protect it. And a lot of organizations will typically turn to the native snapshot as their method of choice for protecting data. And the native snapshot is a wonderful thing. It helps us deliver very, very low RTOs, helps us deliver very low RPOs, but it's not the be all and end all when it comes to data protection, particularly from a cost lens. Snapshots live on some of the most expensive storage in AWS. This is what we're talking about. Lives on EBS volumes. And depending on what region you're in, it varies between 5 and 6 cents per gigabyte per month. 5 and 6 cents doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're dealing with petabytes of data, that adds up very, very quickly. There's got to be a better way to do it. And this is kind of really where Veeam can step in. We'll leverage that native snapshot again for the benefits that it delivers, the RTOs and the RPOs. But what we then will do is we'll take an image-based backup of that snapshot, compress it, and store it on much, much more economical object storage. In AWS's terms, it's Amazon S3. There's a dozen different tiers or classes of S3 that you can leverage, but they start at about 2.3 cents per gig per month, and they go down to fractions of a cent per gig per month. So one of the big ways that we were able to help this organization was leverage the native snapshot. Maybe this isn't specific to this organization, but store it for a relatively small amount of time, maybe measure it in days or weeks, and then start to tier that off as the likelihood of you needing to recover from that data decreases, tear it off onto colder and colder storage, it'll ultimately help you meet your retention requirements, whether those are internally or regulatory compliance enforced, without sacrificing, your budgets. And that ultimately helps free up those budgets that you can then go invest somewhere else. So I kind of spoke a little bit about this organization, but tried to genericize it a bit, Leah, make it pertinent to everyone.
Absolutely. And I think, we'd love to hear from you all in the chat. What really sounded relevant to you in terms of what your organization might be faced with? In particular, I want to know how many of you all are faced with this kind of environment where you've inherited different kinds of environments and platforms. I know a lot of the customers we speak to have that kind of situation where they might have previously been an all Azure or an all AWS shop, but then they acquire a company or somebody comes in and their flavor of ice cream is Google Cloud or something. And all of a sudden you're in this kind of multi-cloud environment where we have all these different platforms and all these different tools in place, right? So talking about that in terms of that technical debt, things that you have acquired that you now need to manage. And in a perfect world, you'd obviously wipe the slate clean, start with one thing fresh, but of course, that's just not our reality in most of the cases. So trying to figure out how you manage and juggle all those different kinds of environments and kinds of tools and kinds of people, I'm sure resonates with a lot of you. So let us know in the chat what resonates most with you all. Let us know if you've got that multi-cloud situation, because certainly I think a lot of folks can also commiserate with you. But there is kind of a silver lining. And Sam, I think now we want to talk about some of those results, because those are some pretty hefty challenges, of course, that a lot of organizations are faced with. But for this particular organization, again, we've anonymized this, when they were working with Forrester, which is an outside vendor, they saw some pretty big results using Veeam. Of course, nobody wants to spend a significant amount of time, money, resources on backup. You want to be doing things that are achieving outcomes for your organization, trying to drive innovation. Backup may not be the thing that you want to spend that time and that money on. So Sam, why don't you talk to us about some of these results that they saw?
Yeah, before that, I think you just make a great point, which is, data protection is, or backup or data resilience is an absolutely necessary thing. It's like, we just liken it to insurance, right? You want to get the best policy possible at the cheapest amount or the cheapest price possible. And it kind of comes true with backup, but you definitely don't want to expose gaps in your data resilience or protection strategy at the sake of costing a few dollars. I think down the line, it's going to cost you more. And that's what I was talking about earlier. We'll give you the benefits of the native snapshot. We'll give you the cost of much more cost optimized storage. And that's exactly what this organization saw. So a significant portion of this came from the infrastructure, the cloud storage infrastructure savings that they exhibited with Veeam. So 185% ROI, representing a $2.1 million net present value. And that was, I believe, over the course of 3 years. So the storage and how we do it absolutely contributed a lot to this, but there were a number of other benefits that they reaped with Veeam versus using a point product, either a first party product or another like native cloud product from another vendor. The first one was just being able to consolidate the data protection management of their hybrid cloud estate, right? Yes, we mentioned that they've been using AWS for 6 years. Also mentioned they've got 2 very large data centers as well. One of the big things that Veeam is going to help in terms of just making your life easier, but obviously saving costs, is federating, unifying, standardizing, centralizing the data protection across all of your environments, right? So whether that's on premises, at the edge, at a remote location, in one or more clouds, we'll help you standardize that. And again, that's great from an FTE perspective. They actually reallocated one of those 10 engineers to another area of the business. That ultimately drives the business forward, right? We're freeing up not just that capital, but also freeing up the resourcing to go ahead and work on, application modernization, other transformative initiatives. Other benefits that they experienced as well, of course, you don't have to go out and buy a secondary piece of software, all the licenses, the training necessary for the additional product. But then also, like, look at this: time testing patches and managing production updates, an 80% reduction in time spent doing that. These are, I'm just going to say it for lack of a better term right now, necessary evils. Like, you absolutely need to be doing these things, but this isn't what, gets people excited. It's kind of like the insurance of the world. You want to be doing these things and you want to be doing them properly, have the best coverage, but you don't want to be spending an inordinate amount of resources and money on these. So again, this organization was able to reduce that by 80%, further allowing them to reinvest that in other strategic areas that is going to grow their business, make them more competitive in market.
Totally. And I think one of the big things to kind of give back to this audience here is a lot of you all probably get faced with these kinds of trade-offs every day, right? Of trying to figure out where you can save these costs. And what we're trying to illustrate here is that there's a bigger story to be had in standardizing your backups, in optimizing your policies and setting everything the way that you really need it across a heterogeneous environment. And I think a lot of the times folks are really pushed to sacrifice on those RPOs and those RTOs because those seem like the low-hanging fruits. So if you're faced with this kind of conversation within your organization, we really encourage you to take this study back to your teams to really fight the case for where you can find cost savings elsewhere besides sacrificing on those RPOs and those RTOs, because again, there's just a better way to tell that kind of story, and Veeam is trying to empower you all with that strategy. So please take the study back. Please use it in conversations with your teams. We hope that it helps you all trying to make that case to not sacrifice on resilience, but still find ways to optimize your spend. And that's been the story for, again, a lot of our customers. And Sam and I in particular, we wanted to spend some time talking about a few of our customer success stories. There's one in particular that I absolutely love talking about. There's another that I think, especially since yesterday was in the United States, at least National Dog Day, we probably want to spend some time talking about Best Friends Animal Society. But again, I just want to encourage everyone, let us know in the chat where you're calling in from. We'll do the map one more time after these success stories, because I think it's a great way to show how we're all banding in this together. We're all trying to improve data resilience within our own organizations, or for those of you who are partners working with customers to make sure that they're achieving their outcomes. So Sam, talk to me a bit about Britvic, because I actually haven't heard about this story before. I'd love to hear more.
I actually want to talk about the Best Friends Society one, because it's
fine.
I tell you, okay, I'll tell you why I want to talk about it. And it's not just because it was apparently National Dog Day yesterday, which I didn't know, but for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's on the opposite end of the spectrum of the kind of TEI study that we just spoke about. It's somewhat easy to show big numbers when you're dealing with a big enterprise. Best Friends Animal Society kind of lives on the other end, not-for-profit organization. They introduced Veeam, and this is another great story in terms of how they were able to be more efficient with their storage resource utilization and save that money, and then where they reinvested it. So Best Friends Animal Society was saving in the region of $40,000 per year. They're a not-for-profit organization. What kind of animals are they called again, Leah? Like adoption animals? I don't know.
Rescue
animals. They took that $40,000 that they were spending on data protection. They're still getting the same degree, if not better, data protection, but they were saving that $40,000. They reinvested it in a data warehouse for predictive analytics, which ultimately drove better outcomes for those rescue animals. So yeah, I mean, it's just a great story, and again, on the opposite end. And I think another good one is Ciox Health, and this is one of my personal favorites, because it not only talks about cost savings in the cloud, but it talks about the importance of data freedom, which is a core tenet of Veeam's portfolio. Data freedom is all about the ability to mobilize your data across different platforms, and Ciox Health is doing just that. They were wholly on premises across a number of different data centers. They decommissioned those data centers and ultimately chose to have a mix of AWS Azure, and a co-location. And the stuff in the co-location is being backed up to AWS. The stuff in AWS is being backed up to Azure, and the stuff in Azure is being backed up to AWS. So lots of egress traffic. And they're dealing with, I think, 500 terabytes of daily backups, and they're spending 20 grand a month on backup. That is for the software licensing, the compute, the storage, the networking, the transactions, the traffic, the egress that we highlighted on the previous slide. So they're a fantastic example of how you can get that multi-cloud, that cross-cloud resilience without blowing out your budgets. And the way that they were doing that was leveraging things like direct connect and express routes to avoid egress traffic while still egressing data. So that's also a fantastic example if you guys want to go and read that. But yeah, I mean, some great success stories, different industries across different degrees of the spectrum in terms of size. Veeam is helping hundreds, thousands of organizations out there be more cost effective in the cloud. We can help you. So like Leah says, my recommendation would be look at your AWS bill, look at your Azure bill, look at your Google Cloud bill. How much are you spending on data protection? Look at the snapshot costs, the storage costs. And on our Veeam website, we've got these great new calculators where you can put in some high-level, I think it's no more than 9 questions, high-level information about your cloud environment, and have a look at how much your storage would cost with Veeam versus a snapshot-only approach. And that, I mean, you'll see that it pays for itself, frees up that capital, and you can start going and doing things like Best Friends does, like the TEI participant did, like Ciox, like Britvic.
Absolutely. And again, doing all of that without sacrificing that resilience. One of the champions on that Ciox Health story is actually their Chief Information Security Officer. She really looked to Veeam as a way to standardize their recovery strategy in the event of a cybersecurity attack. Also building in resiliency with those zero trust principles throughout. So portability, access rights, all part of that story. And again, part of how she was able to make that business case was showing that total economic impact. So I think that's a really great story. If you're seeing a blob of white behind me pop in and out of camera, that's my dad's own rescue. She is a Great Pyrenees, and Pyrenees don't typically get adopted because they are big balls of fluff that gunk up the air filters in everyone's homes. So I'm a big fan of that Best Friends story, because I just think that, again, part of what we're trying to show here is it's all about achieving those outcomes. Backup shouldn't get in the way, right, of achieving the outcomes for an organization. So you shouldn't have to sacrifice those outcomes in order to spend what you need to spend on backup. We really want to make sure that we're driving down those costs and staying focused on what matters most. So Sam, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of these stories. And again, we want to give this back to the audience to give you all the ammunition you might need to go and talk about a transformation effort, take a look at those cloud spends and figure out where you can cost save so that you don't sacrifice on resilience within your own organization. If you want to talk a bit more about resilience, we actually have a live full day event coming up at the very beginning of October. It is Veeam On Data Resilience Summit. Typically, we do Veeam On events throughout the year around the world, but this is kind of our capstone event at Veeam, where we're bringing the best of the best together in a studio to broadcast the latest and greatest information from Veeam, as well as bringing in some expert guests. So we encourage you to register online. This event is free and it is available worldwide. And we will also be posting more information about the agenda, including additional speakers, sessions that will be available, so you can see everything that we have to offer in the data resilience space. So we're very excited about that event. We'll be talking a lot about that more in the month ahead. But if you'd like to continue the conversation this week, we do have Tech Bites on Thursday, and they will be joined by another one of my very good friends, Dante Orsini from 1111 Systems. They are a great VCSP partner of ours, longtime partner. I've known Dante for about a decade now, and they at 1111 are super passionate about disaster recovery as a service. So just like Sam was mentioning with SIOX, backing up data to different clouds, they do the same thing. It's an opportunity for you to back up and even replicate data to their cloud. And then in the event of some kind of natural disaster, an outage, what have you, you have the opportunity to fail over to that cloud data center. So join the Tech Bytes team on Thursday to hear more about disaster recovery as a service. And of course, register online for Veeam Data Resilience Summit. We will be back next week with another episode of Industry Insights. But for now, thank you all so much for joining us. Sam, thank you again.
Thanks for having me, and thanks everyone.
Have a great day.